Dan, just one quick thing. You're coming in as Northwest Gas Association. If you wanted to change that to your name, that might be easier for folks. If you go over on the participant panel, there's a option there to be able to change the name. There we go. Thank you. Great. I'm seeing a bunch of other people joining in. Thank you guys. We'll start here in just a couple minutes. George, I like your backdrop.
Yep, I don't have a lot of decoration in the office, so I just walk around like this all over.
Well, there's no question about your affiliation there. That's good. All right. Thanks to folks for joining in. We'll get started here in just a minute or so. One thing that we're going to ask advisory committee members to do once we get going, but could just start doing it now, is to use your, if you all could have your video on, that's just helpful for knowing who we have, and I think it also helps organize the Zoom screen in a way that we can see who we have. So thanks for folks that just joined in. We'll get started when we've got some critical mass. Sorry about the noise there. All righty. See, let's give folks just a couple more moments here to join in. I think we're pretty close to full participation. Alrighty, great. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for joining in today for the Washington State Energy Advisory Committee meeting. This is the third meeting where we've been together. Though several of you also participated in the webinars that we held in May on the deep decarbonization pathways analysis, and we'll be touching on some of that work today as well. Before we talk about how we want to spend the day today, let me just turn it over to our co-chair, Reeves Clippard, and Reeves to just say a few welcoming words today.
Great, thanks, Tom. It's good to see all of y'all. I really wish it was in person. I hope very much that your families are healthy and safe right now. I want to remind us that during our second meeting, how important it was for us to capture the unique context of working on the state energy strategy during the COVID pandemic. And here we are just a very short time later, layering on another crisis. And I want to acknowledge the pain and the suffering and the frustration our Black communities are experiencing right now. But for really a very long time, well before this pandemic ever came along. And we must recognize that all lives cannot matter until Black lives matter. I want to restate our purpose as an advisory committee as defined in our charter. We'll take just a moment that we're here to provide independent guidance, advice, and recommendations on the state energy strategy that is being developed, especially helping Commerce understand high-level implications, trade-offs, opportunities associated with the implementation of proposed strategies as they relate to the energy planning goals and principles of particular interest in sectors and regions of the state. And as we do this work, you can see in our documents, we see it organized by sectors, industries, underpinned by technological problems and solutions. We see these bullet lists of work to be done, and you'll see at the bottom of each list, last but not least, the acknowledgement of cross-cutting issues, such as achieving equity goals and how to enable communities across the state to benefit from the clean energy transition. During that second meeting, during a breakout session, someone spoke up, and I wish I could remember who it was so I could give him credit. He called attention to the fact that so many of us in the room come from technological backgrounds, trying to solve technological problems with technological solutions first. And really, we really need to be thinking about people first and these broader, less clear, harder to address cross-cutting issues, or they'll end up being an afterthought and will remain unsolved. So each of us is here today representing diverse interests and communities, and even if you're not explicitly representing Black, Indigenous, or Brown people as a constituency, I'd like to encourage all of us here today to use the hurt and the pain we're experiencing as a lens and as a tool to think through our proposed solutions as people helping people before we move to people building technological artifacts. The equity and the inclusion must come first. Tom, thank you for the moment to just be able to say those words. I encourage us all to do good work, to not fall into old habits, so we can all move forward together.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Reeves. And I'd echo Reeves' thanks for everybody to creating this time among all the other things that are going on right now. Let me just say a little bit about today's meeting, the things that we hope to accomplish, and then just a couple things that'll help us participate effectively by Zoom. So the focus of the meeting today really is on three things. One is introducing how we're thinking about the role of the state energy strategy in economic development and some of the economic analysis that's going to be underpinning the work. We've spent some time so far talking about the deep decarbonization analysis, and we'll spend some time today sort of filling out some of the sense of the analytical work on the economic analysis side. We'll also be reviewing where we are with the scenario development for the deep decarbonization analysis, building on the webinars that we had in May. And then we'll be spending the latter half of the meeting really having some discussions to be able to kick off the technical advisory process that'll be playing out over the summer, and really honing in on the framing questions for that work to make sure we're going in with the right questions in mind and the right issues on the table. We'll kind of break the day or the morning into two pieces then. We'll spend the first part of the morning on the economic development and the economic analysis topic, and we have Scott Nystrom from FTI on with us today, who's part of the Clean Energy Transition Institute team, will be able to speak to that following some opening remarks from Lauren McCloy with the Governor Inslee's office. And then we'll talk about deep decarbonization scenarios with Jeremy Hargraves, who folks I think are quite familiar with now. We'll take a break, and then when we come back from the break, we'll talk about the technical advisory process, and we'll talk a little bit at the beginning about the process that we envision for engaging advisory committee members and other experts over the next couple of months. But then we'll also break out into some smaller groups to talk through the framing questions. The way we're going to do those breakouts is to have them be topically oriented, but not just restricted to particular topics. So based on what we've heard from advisory committee members back from some of our inquiries about what parts of the technical advisory process people would like to be connected to, we've made some allocations of people to particular topics that we'll use for those breakouts. So again, each of those will be kind of oriented around a particular sector, but will also be open to discussions in other sectors as well. So hopefully we've done a good job of getting people connected to the issues that that you are most interested in talking about. If not, there will be ample opportunities over the course of the summer to be able to connect in with those particular sectors. We'll have time throughout the day for questions and answers. If it turns out that we've got more questions than we have time to get to today, we'll talk about how to follow up after today's meeting to make sure to get those answered. The other thing is we'll be, as we get into the deep decarbonization scenarios discussion, I just want to make sure that folks know you can go to the Commerce Energy Strategy website, and there's a one-pager there just summarizing the scenarios. And then when we get into the framing question discussion on the website, there's also a link to those draft framing questions. And we distributed those to the advisory committee members ahead of the meeting today. But for those that are following along by YouTube or TVW, you can find those resources there. Or if advisory committee members want to find them in one place, you can find them there as well. So just a couple things about participating effectively via Zoom today. It looks to me like most people are participating through a web link rather than on the phone, which is great. If anybody is participating via phone, we'd encourage you to connect your phone to the video feed so that we can associate your name and your face with your phone number. And you can do that by just going to that up caret next to the phone and mute button on Zoom. I encourage folks to mute yourselves locally. I think most people are doing that today. When we get into the Q&A time, we can mute and unmute people. We'd love to be able to just be able to talk rather than do everything via chat. But if while you're hearing presentations or thoughts or questions are coming to you and it's not Q&A time, feel free to use the chat button to ask any questions, and we'll be tracking those. And then again, when we get to the Q&A, if you want to jump in, I encourage you to raise your hand. You can find the raise your hand button over on the participant panel. So if down along the bottom of your screen, you'll see something that says participants. If you click that, you'll get the panel along the right-hand side, and you can find the mute button there. So I think most people are on video. I'd encourage the advisory committee members to please show your video. That also helps us know who is speaking, and also if people just physically raise your hand, we can see that. Please also update your name if it's not showing up as your name. You can do that also through the participant panel. And then you have the option for viewing. If you want to see everybody in little screens, you can pick that, or if you want to see the speaker highlighted, you can do that, and that's up at the top of your screen. If anybody's having trouble with the technology, please feel free to chat to, in particular, Andy or Heather, Andy Chin or Heather Martin behind the scenes, and we can do some troubleshooting. I do want to say that in addition to people participating via Zoom today, we also have members of the public following along on TVW and YouTube. We're going to be taking a break from those broadcasts during the breakout sessions, largely for technology reasons, which will happen around 11 o'clock to 11:35 approximately. So those that are following along, that's a good time to take a little break, and then you can come back at 11:35, 11:45 or so. And then we'll have 15 minutes at the very end of the meeting for public comments. It's a little tricky to do that with the technology that we have. So what we're asking people to do is, if you have public comments, please email them to energystrategy@commerce.wa.gov, and we'll read those or paraphrase them depending on length at the end of today's meeting. And if you could get those to us by 11:45, that would be very helpful. All right. Let's see, with that, why don't we move into a discussion of economic development and economic analysis in the state energy strategy. And I want to start by turning it over to Lauren McCloy with Governor Inslee's office. And I'll also just stop sharing my screen at this point. And when we get into the state energy strategy analytics, Eileen Quigley, I will turn it over, I believe, to you to share your screen, or to Scott.
Great, thank you, Tom. Good morning, everyone. I'm Lauren McCloy, Senior Policy Advisor to Governor Inslee. Thanks to the co-chairs and the team for all the work that you're doing, that you're putting into this process so far, and for allowing me to make a few remarks this morning. And thank you, Reeves, for setting the stage and acknowledging the moment that we're in right now. We are in unprecedented times. I think everyone realizes that. Washington State's unemployment rate was a record 15.4% in April, and the state's economy lost just under 530,000 jobs. It's the highest jobless rate that the state has seen since it started keeping records. So we have a significant challenge on our hands in terms of getting people back into meaningful work. I think we all realize that. And I do think that, it's going to have some impacts on the work that we're trying to do here. Similarly, we're facing at the state an unprecedented budget shortfall, and we're expecting sharp declines in revenues for state operations. This, knowingly puts stress on critical state programs supporting housing and homelessness, behavioral health, and aid to vulnerable households. And while the state has received some federal funds through the CARES Act, the amount of federal aid so far is really nowhere near sufficient to address the need that we're going to see going forward. For the governor right now, I just want folks to know he is 100% focused on public health and safety and implementing the Safe Start plan. And as economic activity increases in the state, with more people moving around in the economy, our office is really focused on safely getting people back to work while avoiding another spike in COVID transmission. And we're hearing every day from people out there from all corners of the state expressing how incredibly disruptive this pandemic has been to their lives and livelihoods. And navigating this is really an all-consuming challenge for state government and is our highest priority right now. Eventually, we will need to start talking about what economic recovery looks like. And for the energy and infrastructure segments of the economy, I see a role for this effort in that discussion. Many of you have already started asking questions about how this process will consider socioeconomic impacts and where that kind of fits in the development of the state energy strategy. And so I'm really pleased that today Scott Nystrom from FTI Consulting is going to give us an overview of the plans for helping us answer some of those questions in this process. Washington State has some experience with the REMI analysis tools that he's going to talk about in the context of clean energy and climate. We have used REMI. We used it in 2014 to analyze the low carbon fuel standard. And then more recently, the Department of Ecology used it to assess the socioeconomic impacts of the clean air rule. So we do have precedents for using that in policy development. And it's a commonly used and trusted model for all kinds of public policy analysis. So I'm really glad that we were able to secure Scott and his firm's expertise for this process. And I think that this part of the work has become even more critical given where we're at right now. The state energy strategy, and Reeves kind of alluded to this, and I think you all know, is focused on balancing policy priorities for promoting and maintaining economic competitiveness, supporting clean energy workforce, meeting the needs of low-income and vulnerable populations, and addressing both urban and rural community needs. And I think as we learn more about the impacts of the pandemic on Washington State's economy, we'll want to consider how the work we're doing here can inform that economic recovery conversation. Certainly, we don't have all the answers right now, nor do we even really know what all of the impacts are. So there's a lot to be learned over the coming months. I do know that there's a lot of policy interest in this work, and I think we have a great opportunity to help shape that conversation, given the tools and expertise that we have at the table here. So I'm really excited to get this part of the work kicked off with you today, and look forward to continuing to work with you all on shaping the state energy strategy to address the needs of the state going forward. So thank you for allowing me to make some remarks on that at the beginning, and I'll kick it over back to you, Tom.
Thanks, Lauren. Great. So as Lauren alluded to, I want to talk a bit now about economic analysis for the state energy strategy. So Eileen, why don't I turn it over to you, Eileen Quigley with the Clean Energy Transition Institute, to introduce Scott, as well as I think some of the other speakers that we'll have today. And then either Scott or Eileen, you can share your screen for the slides.
Thanks, Tom. I think I'm actually not going to bother to share my screen. I'll let Scott just start. Since you'd also gone through all of the people who will be speaking, I'm going to be very brief. So good morning to all, and thank you very much for being here today. Thank you, Reeves, for your excellent opening remarks, and also Lauren for the context you're setting. Just before we get started with the agenda that Tom has already outlined, I wanted to take a minute to thank all of the advisory committee members and the many others who have been following along with the technical advisory process for engaging with the Clean Energy Transition Institute team since we met as a full group. Through the webinars that we've done on deep decarbonization modeling and scenario development, we've had several really good conversations with stakeholders about the modeling and the assumptions. And I'd like to encourage you to continue to reach out to us with your questions and your recommendations. I think we're current in responding to all that we've received, but we would like to continue to engage in that dialogue with you over the coming months. So as we've mentioned, today we have the 3 agenda items. We're going to hear from Scott, who's going to explain the models and methodology he's going to use to help us assess the economic impacts of the policies and actions that will be developed through the technical advisory process. And he's also going to touch briefly on the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic as they are known at this time. Then Jeremy Hargreaves will review where we stand with the deep decarbonization pathways modeling the scenarios based on the feedback we've received since we introduced them 2 weeks ago. Modeling the reference and central case will get underway after today's meeting. And then the 4 cases that we will run off of the central case will be done in conjunction with the technical advisory process in July and August. And you'll see a process graphic later that Mark Dadon will show how it shows how all of this ties together. After the short break, Mark Dadon with the Clean Energy Transition Institute will walk you through the technical advisory process, and then Michael Lazarus of the Stockholm Environment Institute will lead us into the 3 breakout sessions with the technical advisory process leads. So thank you all very much for your ongoing engagement in this very important process. And I'm going to turn over to Scott.
All right. I will say good afternoon, everybody. Nice to meet you all for the first time. Let me change actually the way of sharing my screen. Stop sharing, you share. Let's do this screen so we get the full PowerPoint. So I can say good afternoon because I actually am in Eastern time. I'm based out of Columbus, Ohio. And as was mentioned earlier, I'm going to be the main technical macroeconomic economic impact analysis for this project. So what I have here for everybody today is a short presentation, about 20 slides. Some of them are appendices that we won't go through in detail, but I will reference them in case people are curious to look at more detailed information later on after this call and after this conversation. So here's the agenda, what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to very briefly give an overview of FTI and myself, just for context. I don't want to belabor that point at all. I'm going to spend probably the most time on the economic impact analysis and what exactly goes on in type of that modeling and what exactly it is contextually and how it works for people, just to give everyone an intuitive understanding of how those models work and what they consider and what they give you in terms of results and how you're going to consider them once we have them. And then, as Eileen mentioned at the end of this, I'm going to do a short discussion about where the economy nationally and in Washington State is because of COVID-19, where it's likely going to be going and what implications that has for the state energy strategy. So with that, I'll go first into FTI, just as an overview. So FTI is a large, about 5,000 people, management consulting firm that does economic analysis, statistical analysis, research for all sorts of companies, all sorts of trade associations, law firms, and governments as well. The group that I'm part of at FTI is called the Economic Impacts Group. And what we do are answer what-if questions. And those what-if questions are, what if a public policy is implemented? What if a private investment is made? What if the Fed changes interest rates? What if trade policy changes? Just large what-if questions about markets and the economy and what those implications will be for various stakeholders, the public, various economic sectors, demographic groups, government, shareholders, whatever it might be. So we answer those what-if questions. What we're going to be doing here, though, is the specific list kind of in the center here. You'll probably see a couple, 4 specific kind of points there that are dotted out. We'll talk about what happens to the economy and the macroeconomy. We'll talk about the distributional impacts. So there's a few times in here that I use the word distributional. That's the same as the equity analysis or the socioeconomic analysis that was discussed from the outset of this. So we'll be talking about that as a distributional analysis, is a term economists commonly use, and then also the demographics of the impact of the state energy strategy. I'll also give a little overview of 2 models. REMI got talked up a lot at the beginning of this, and we're going to use it, but we're also going to use some capabilities of a kind of similar model, not as detailed, that's used at an equally wide breadth of clients and different applications called IMPLAN. And just to give a little introduction to myself while we're on the REMI topic is a lot of those projects that Lauren discussed earlier that the state has used, whether it's directly in the state government or through arrangements with other consulting firms. I used to work for REMI. It was my full-time job for 5 years, and I was the head of their technical support. I was part of their development team. I was the head of their economic consulting team. And I was the technical support person on a number of those projects for the state for 5 years. So that model is very familiar to me. I don't use it as much now as going off in the consulting world myself day to day as I used to, but still very familiar with it. And we'll also use a little bit of IMPLAN to supplement its capabilities. So with that, we'll continue on and start with economic impact analysis. And I'm going to start from scratch here. I'm going to assume that some people on this call are familiar with what economic impact analysis is and what it does and how it works. but I'm also going to assume that there's others out there that probably aren't as sure even what it is conceptually. So I'm going to start from the ground up and bring everybody up to speed. So here's what it is. I'm going to start by defining what it isn't really. So there's two boxes here with a couple little fun clip art images inside of them. One on the left is energy systems analysis. That is what you all have been exposed to and familiar with so far through the pathways analysis. So what that handles is we have an energy system in the state, and it has several different things that it needs to provide. It needs to provide energy for transportation, for heating, for industrial processes. It needs to provide electricity for lighting and everything else. And how is the state's energy sector, the states, the Pacific Northwest, the United States, North America, is going to actually provide that? Of course, one of the big implications out of that process is emissions, which is one of the overall goals here. So what you've been exposed to so far in the scenario development is really energy systems analysis. You've been talking about how power generation is going to look, the transportation and heating and industrial sectors are going to look, and how energy transmission and distribution is going to look. And those are complex models that allow you to ask some very important questions and give you some very detailed results about how the energy system is going to look now and into the future under different scenarios that have different inputs, different implications, and different goals about them. So that's all well and good. What economic impact analysis does is it illustrates the entire economy, all businesses and economic sectors, all governments, state, local, federal, and then also all households, and how they're going to respond to the changes in incentives and how they're going to make different decisions and investments and make changes as a consequence of the energy sector changing. So an economic model isn't concerned with energy production and distribution. It's concerned with the economy as a whole. It's concerned with the production, distribution, and consumption of every commodity in an economy. So there's 6 little clip arts there that are meant to give you a full breadth of the economy that an economic impact model has inside of it. So REMI has an agricultural sector, very important for this. It has manufacturing and several different types of manufacturers. It's not just a monolithic manufacturing sector. It has light and heavy. It has various different commodities and types. It has primary manufacturing. It has finished goods, non-durables, durables, all that stuff. Construction's in there as an example. It has a service sector, personal and business services, healthcare, education, all that. It has households and it has government. So how are these going to be affected when the energy system changes? How exactly that integration is done, I have a slide for in a second, which is what I'm going to get to next right here. So an energy model, broadly speaking, pathways in this instance, gives you several sets of results that kind of map into variables for the broader economy. I have 4 examples here. This is generalized, so just as an example, this isn't quite literally the structure we might take when we finish the model in here, but it's going to look something like this. So an energy model is going to tell you what's going to happen to energy. I call it infrastructure, but that's transmission lines, that's power plants of all different types, that's pipelines, that's storage capacities, everything. How is that going to change in the electricity sector and the fossil fuel sector? And those are parts of the economy. The utility and the power generation and distribution sector and the mining and processing sectors are all part of the economy, so that goes in the economic model. Energy models also discuss how technology changes, and that technology is, broadly speaking, for heating and transportation and industrial processes. And that's going to affect energy users, and those are households and firms. So how are their decisions and incentives and prices and costs going to be different as a consequence of what the energy model says? Price is a very important part of any economic model that does this kind of stuff, both for electricity and fossil fuels, because that affects the cost-facing customers. So that'll affect households and firms as well. And then also emissions. Most economic models do not consider greenhouse gas a part of the economic impact, simply because greenhouse gases are a global externality. It's a global issue. But they do consider usually conventional air pollution. So think of process and smokestack and tailpipe emissions of NOx and SOx and particulate matter and the like, those co-benefits that come along with greenhouse gases. And that affects what the model calls amenity, but that's just attractiveness. That's the health effects that are associated in the saving and lost productivity that's associated with improved air quality. So the model is going to account for all these different things. We're going to take the outputs of the energy model on these different fronts, and we're going to map them into industries, and we're going to map them into households and governments and different policy variables and prices in the economic model. And we're going to see what the economy looks like different in the future as a consequence of that. So to talk about that, I'm going to talk about the models themselves, and then the results that you get out of them. So this here is the structure of a model called IMPLAN. So IMPLAN didn't get Lauren's introduction earlier, but it's in wide use throughout the state. Several of the state universities, I know for a fact, have a license. I've seen studies come out from them. IMPLAN works on a concept of, I think the best way to explain this is think of an old factory town. This could be in the Midwest, this could be in the Pacific Northwest, this could be anywhere really. Think of a small 10, 20,000 person factory town, kind of the 1950s or 60s of yore, where you had one big factory that was kind of dominated the town's economy, and around it you had a number of suppliers that would help and aid in producing materials and equipment for that factory. And then the town itself was supported by that industry. That's where the money tax base came from for schools, for local government, for infrastructure, for the healthcare system, and for all the other kind of personal services, think like restaurants and hotels and retail around that. So what IMPLAN does is it illustrates that concept of kind of the factory town and the supply chain and everything that's supported by it around it, but it does it in an economic model where it's not constrained by geography. So what IMPLAN says is that every industry supports the supply chain, and the supply chain in the industry supports spending by consumers. So that's going to be a concept that's going to be inside of the modeling we're going to be doing. That if something gets built, if infrastructure is invested in, or new manufacturing capacity comes online, or agricultural production expands, it's going to affect its supply chain and consumer expenditures. And that's foundational to the way that this modeling is done. And REMI has the same concept inside of it. But unfortunately, with IMPLAN, it's missing a lot of kind of effects that are important in the short term and with energy. And in order to account for those, we need to upgrade to more of an equilibrium model, which is the aforementioned REMI. So REMI has a 5-block structure. There's a more detailed version of this in the end of the presentation that's got a lot of kind of arrows and boxes on it if anyone's curious to look at it. And I'm happy to take any questions now or offline if anybody's curious to talk through any of this, or have references to their documentation for their data sources or their model equations, which are all publicly available. The software to run it is proprietary, but the model itself is actually open source and documented. IMPLAN has block 1 and block 2. It has output, so it has production, and it has labor and capital demand. So it has essentially the inputs that need to go into production. But what IMPLAN doesn't have is block 3, 4, and 5, which are the left, right, and the bottom of it. So population, wages, and market shares. So what REMI does that IMPLAN doesn't, and we're going to account for in our modeling here. So kind of starting from the beginning is the scenario modeling of the intersector is going to be completed based on the scenarios that everyone agrees on. That's going to tell us what's going to happen to the energy system of the state and the region and the country to an extent as a consequence of those policies and those scenarios. Those are going to develop inputs into the model, and we're going to account for what that does to the economy inside the model. And here's what we're going to account for in the long term. So one thing that REMI has that's nice about itself compared to some other models, it has a full demographic model inside of it. So people are born and die inside the model. There's immigration internationally. There's migration domestically. People do not have to live and work in the same place. There's commuting. People can move in and out of different states in response to the strength of the labor market and cost of living. So we're going to be accounting for all those things. Labor is mobile inside of the United States. Inside the model, we'll be accounting for that. To give an example of this that I'd have, just to show everybody a little bit of a tidbit here, this is the actual model software. It's not Washington, it's the United States. I just have it for a separate project and I want to show you all quickly. And this is the model's population forecast nationally. In 2001, the United States had about 285 million people. This is about 330 right now, and this is growing to not quite 400, 390 million by 2060. So we have this line inside the model of what population looks like, but we're going to be able to see how this line changes in response to the different policy decisions and scenarios that we have in the future. Again, this is national, not Washington, but I think it kind of demonstrates the point of the fact that REMI has demographics and a forecast. The other thing that REMI has inside of it that's going to be useful is it actually has explicit variables for energy costs. It has prices for heating fuels, for transportation fuels, for electricity, and for natural gas. And then for all other energy types as well. So that block down at the bottom has prices in it. And prices are an important decision factor about how businesses and households consume, produce, and where they locate themselves. And then on block 5, it's the far right one, the market share, the one that looks like a little globe, is competitiveness. The model has different regions and different countries competing against each other for labor and capital and for production and business activity. So as wages, prices, and profits change, competitiveness change, imports and exports change, not just internationally, but from Washington to its neighbors and the rest of the country and the rest of the world. So we're able to assess all these very high level things inside the economic model because of its detail and its dynamic structure of having the bottom 3, the left and right and the bottom structures to it that IMPLAN does not. So with that, I've talked through a high level kind of conceptually how these models work. Now I'm going to talk a little more technical, not very, but a little more technical about what's going into them, and then also what type of results they're generating. So on the left, let's start with modeling assumptions. The major data sources for both REMI and IMPLAN are the 3 or 4, we can count EIA in there, 4 federal agencies that are described. The Bureau of Economic Analysis is the most important one because that gives us the regional data for wages and production and just essentially everything. Bureau of Labor Statistics supplements that with labor market data, though the BEA kind of repackages a lot of that for you anyways, but the BEA and the BLS are fundamental to how these models are built. The U.S. Census Bureau is, of course, fundamental to the demographics inside the model. And then the energy sector, REMI does not have nearly as detailed as an energy sector as the pathways modeling does, but what is in there is based on EIA data. IMPLAN really does not have an energy sector inside of it. It just has production, like energy is any other sector, so we don't have to worry about it in this case. When REMI builds the model, so the model works out of the box. REMI's developers ship it calibrated and ready to go. The energy concepts inside the model are based on the Annual Energy Outlook's most recent reference case. Again, that's produced by EIA, and that's going to broadly align with the underlying assumption that's in the pathways modeling here. So we're starting from the same starting points as models. They treat the energy sector differently, but they're starting from the same set of facts and assumptions, and those facts and assumptions are coming from the Department of Energy and the EIA. So we're starting at the same place. REMI does include a couple macro forecasts in the short, medium, and long term that are from different sources. The short term, and by short term I mean 2 or 3 years, is the University of Michigan forecast. They have their forecast online. They have a nice 2-page PDF summary if anybody wants to read it that's written for a general audience. And I've actually a slide a little bit later in this presentation summarizing the Michigan forecast. So we'll get a little taste of that, everybody together here soon. The medium term, and by medium term I mean about 10 years, is from the BLS. The BLS produces a macroeconomic forecast about what the U.S. economy is going to look like in 2028. They're about to release 2030, so that's from BLS. And then long term, there's a census demographic forecast, and then REMI's own economists do some analysis to come up with that. So the underlying assumptions in the model are consistent where they need to be with the modeling that's being done otherwise. It's from federal sources, and then the underlying assumptions of the model are pretty straightforward and transparent as well. Now the results generated. This is actually a 2-parter slide, and I'll get to how it's a 2-parter in a moment. So results generated, both REMI and IMPLAN give you high-level kind of headline macroeconomic impacts. Employment, business sales, gross domestic product or gross regional product or gross state product, whatever number or term you prefer, household income, state and local government tax revenues. REMI is the only one that gives you a year-by-year concept. IMPLAN just kind of has a before and after, like when a supply chain produces, what's the impact, but it doesn't really have an annual concept. REMI works like that line chart I showed you a little earlier, where it's showing year by year how does the curve change. REMI also is the only one that has demographics to it. Now, I'm kind of nodding towards my next slide concept here, where we talk about breaking down these results. So these high-level, overall results are important, I do believe. But as we talked about earlier, the distribution or the equity impacts of this, and there's several different dimensions of this, and that's what the next slide's about, are just as important. So I frame this as a series of questions, and they're questions that we can answer, or we're planning to answer, and I think we can on all of them. There's a more detailed slide in the appendix if anybody's curious to dig back there later that gives a little more detail on what exactly is going to be covered and what kind of the methodologies behind them are, but this is just a high-level summary for everybody. One question, of course, is what is the regional impact? So these models can not just do the state level, so just treating Washington as a single entity, but they can break it down, be it from a regional concept, look at the eastern part, the western part, Puget Sound, all that. But also they can look at counties, and then you can use that same set of data to look at urban versus rural. That's one breakdown, geographical. Second one is how are different economic sectors influenced? The two most important ones, probably, though everybody is important, but two to key on are definitely agriculture and manufacturing. I discussed earlier, the model has detailed agriculture and manufacturing sectors, so we'll be able to look at the impacts of them specifically when we do this. Another one is income strata, so the distribution of income, quintiles, quartiles, that kind of stuff. That's also present inside the results we're going to have. Another breakdown is on the demographic component. How does this affect different races and ethnicities? That's another question we'll ask and answer. And then also on sex between men and women. How does this affect them differently? This is a historically true point, but the 2008-2009 recession was generally speaking a stronger recession for men because they were so concentrated in sectors like construction, which took a large hit from that. We don't know what the COVID recession is going to do, but it's not necessarily the same between men and women. So that's another angle of equity we're going to look at. And then also age. And the age concept here is handled really in two ways. One is looking at essentially age groups now, young and old. So if we just look at 2020 or 2025, kind of the near future, how would young and old look at each other? But then there's another aspect to this. Because we're going to be doing the analysis both for a few decades essentially, how are the impacts going to look on people alive now, alive and working now, or alive and retired now, whatever it might be, versus those who will be doing the same decades from now. So the equity is not just old and young currently, but it's also between generations over time. And because the model is dynamic, we can analyze it in those terms. So the next part we're going to talk about is an economic recovery. And I'm going to get to that slide from the University of Michigan. This is their forecast. Again, it's available online if anybody wants more detail that they provide. So this is US only. They don't break out states with the exception of Michigan itself, but this is for the US, and I think it still gives you some informative lessons nationally, or for the region for Washington. So we look at 2019, we see US GDP and the growth rate and the unemployment rate. I also included a few things in here that aren't just a high level kind of headline numbers you hear about growth and unemployment. I also tried to put some that are more in kind of like physical terms. In that case, I used light vehicles and private housing starts just to get a sense of how industry is doing on that level. So we look at 2019 and then we see 2020. The Michigan forecast says the economy is going to shrink 4% this year. The unemployment rate is currently higher than 10.5%. It's 13.4, I believe, and it's a little bit higher than that in Washington right now. But they predict, and most other forecasters do, that the economy is going to recover at least some this year, not all the way certainly, but it's going to recover some this year. So the average unemployment rate for the year will end up being about 10.5%. If the relationship between the US and the Washington rate remains consistent, and those things tend to most of the time, that would mean Washington's average unemployment rate for the year would be between 12 and 13% once we're done with it. And you can see that all the physical measurements of economic activity, be it manufacturing capacity or vehicle production or private housing starts, are all down very strongly as well. So the fact that this year is going to be a recession and going to be kind of rough, I don't think probably shocks anybody. We've heard that news. But what's important, I think, is what's going to happen in the next couple of years. I'm going to define that as kind of the short term or the short medium term. You can see that the forecast has the economy getting going again. It gets growing again, but it's not very quickly. It's 3.5, not quite 3.5%. It's 2.1%. And the unemployment rate stays somewhat stubbornly high. It comes down, but it's going to have to kind of grind its way down back to a 6 or a 5 or a 4, more of a full employment concept of where it was previously. And the other measurements, manufacturing capacity comes back pretty nicely, but vehicle sales and housing starts, construction and the automotive sector are huge parts of the economy. They're not back to where they started. So it's going to take a little time to get us back to where we are. We've been knocked down and we're getting up, but we're getting up slowly. It's not going to happen within 6 months or 12 months. It's going to take at least a couple of years, at least through 2022, as the Michigan forecast has it. And what this means for the state energy strategy, thinking about this in the short term, is what opportunities does this present? The biggest one, of course, is that economic recovery is going to be the foundation and focus of policy federally and at the state level and local level for the next couple of years, probably. It certainly was after the 2008, 9, 10 recession, where that was very, very important and dominating in all policy discussions for, I'd say, at least a good 5 years after that. And it's probably going to be the same thing here. The good news is fiscal policy is very accommodating at the federal level, and so is monetary policy. And the upshot of monetary policy being accommodative is interest rates are low. And because interest rates are low, it makes it cheap to make long-term investments. These could be made by both private and public entities for that matter. It's a cheap time to borrow money, and it's cheap to amortize payments. So if you're investing in infrastructure or equipment or production capacity, it's cheap to do so now. If you need to make long-term maintenance or replacement that you've been planning, it's a cheap time to do it. We have a projection of an elevated unemployment rate, which means workers are going to be available, and it means it's going to be good to put them to work. As I showed on the slide before, if unemployment is going to be about 7% in the United States, maybe a little higher in Washington going forward for at least the next 4 or 5 years, there's labor available, and getting to work is a good thing. Same thing on the manufacturing capacity side, where if manufacturing capacity is being used at a lower rate, that means it can ramp up if there's things for it to do to produce materials and equipment. And then all of these together, labor, capital, inputs, that's essentially what I've talked to. Unemployment is cost of labor, capital is interest rates, and input costs is the manufacturing capacity. Those are all going to be low, at historic lows in some cases. So this makes conditions favorable for investments in the short term. And just to kind of talk through one final slide here to give everybody a capstone. So this here, I'm just picking solar because it's a clean example. There's going to be lots of things that are opportunities, of course. I'm just picking solar because I had a nice kind of list of facts here for everybody. So this here shows everybody the current solar sector in the state of Washington according to the Solar Energy Industry Association, so their trade association. And it's a little map here about where the sector is actually located. But I wanted to bring this back to everybody that say that the state has had about $650 million in capital investments in solar all time. That is something that could change because interest rates and costs are so low, as I mentioned on the previous slide. The other thing I want to note too is that think through an economy, not just in terms of the sector itself, but think through the interconnections that I mentioned earlier. The main reason I brought this slide up is actually because of the colors on the map, where if you look at the colors, they symbolize 3 different things. The red one's the manufacturers, the blue one's the installers, and the green is other. So red means they're producing equipment and materials related to the solar sector. Blue means they're installing the infrastructure, so people on roofs, people putting in utility scale, whatever it might be. And green means other. That could mean financing, that could mean professional services, that could mean design and engineering, could mean a lot of things. But the logic that this slide and the logic that that map is talking us through is actually kind of how IMPLAN and REMI work, where if you have some sort of direct investment, it's not just going to go to that. It's also going to affect the supply chain. It's also going to affect consumer expenditures and other support sectors around it. And it's not just going to affect, itself. It's also going to change the state's energy infrastructure. So all these things are going to kind of come together, and all these kind of things in the energy sector are going to change, and all these things in the economic modeling are going to change as well. So with that, that's the high level stuff that I had to introduce everybody else. I'll really quickly flash a couple of the appendices if people are curious about them later. But otherwise, I think it's time for questions. And if anybody has anything offline, there's my contact information. Please reach out.
Great, Scott. Thanks so much. Let's see, we've got several questions that have come in through chat during the presentation. So let me run through those, and a couple of them are related to each other. So a question from Nancy Hirsch about is there any Washington specific economic data included in the model? And then Scott Rothland added a follow-up to Nancy's questions about whether the EIA data that is used for the energy outlook, is it national, regional, or specific to Washington?
Sure. So when I say federal on this slide here, I mean a federal agency. The data itself from BEA, BLS, census, all that is typically at least a state level, if not a metropolitan area level, if not a county level, and in some cases actually below that. So the Washington model we'll be using is calibrated with Washington data, and the county models we'll be using from IMPLAN are calibrated with county data for them. So the federal there is, again, in reference to the federal agencies providing the data, but the information itself is tailored to Washington. So that's the first thing. Second thing, the EIA data is at a regional level. They do a Pacific region, and the Pacific region includes California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii. They do not provide in their forecast, unfortunately, a state-specific result. They provide only a West Coast Pacific result. So it's not national, but it's not ideally state, but it is at least for the far west coast of the country.
Great, thanks, Scott. Let's see, and then we just had a comment on the presentation from Cam, colleague of Clay Norris at Tacoma Power, on noting that on the slide 6 where we talk about liquid fuels and gaseous fuels, noting that there's efforts underway to develop non-carbon liquid and gaseous fuels in the power sector also, in addition to the transportation sector.
Yeah. That's a very fair point. That's definitely something that's included in, say, the technology. It's impossible to make a structure that implements all these perfectly, but yes, biofuels, for instance, are definitely something that can be included in the energy model and the economic impact model.
Great. Let's see, and then Dan Kirshner asks a question: why UM and not a more local resource for short-term macroeconomic forecasts?
The main reason for that is REMI develops the model using the Michigan forecast. So that's just to show everybody what's underneath the model as it is right now. The other reason is not every state and not every university has like a macroeconomic forecasting shop. Michigan is very unique in that. Their macro forecasting shop was founded by a couple Nobel Prize winners back in the 1950s, and they've been at it for a long time. It's also nice too because the University of Michigan macro forecast is available online for free if anybody wants to look at the PDF, so there's a transparency there. So the reason it's not done with a more local shop is REMI uses the Michigan forecast because they're pretty much the best in the game, and two, I'm not aware of any universities or macro forecasting shops in the state of Washington doing this. Most states either rely on like a Michigan forecast or they'll turn to like a Wall Street firm that produces it to do their macro forecast. And I don't think Washington has like a homegrown one like that.
Great, thanks, Scott. Let me take a couple of the other questions that have come in via chat, and then I see that George, you've got your hand raised as well, and we'll get you into the queue. Nicole Hughes is asking, can you please provide reference to studies which have used the REMI model as an example?
Be happy to. Follow up with me. But REMI's, the company's from 1980 itself. It has a client base in essentially all 50 states. It gets used a couple times a day for studies like this, essentially. So I'd be happy to provide at least a couple example studies of the model in action.
Great. And then Senator Ibarra is asking a question about whether the model can break down by balancing authorities rather than counties, since the utility is managed by balancing authority.
Yeah, so this is a great example of where energy systems analysis and economic impact analysis are kind of different from each other. The economic impact analysis is based on essentially political boundaries like counties, while of course energy systems analysis is going to account for more the physical divisions in the electricity system and the pipeline system and stuff like that. The best we could do on those grounds would be kind of do a mapping between the counties and the balancing authorities. I know that's not perfect. I know their lines cross each other, obviously, but that's going to be the closest version of what we can do. And the inputs to the model are going to be, different for different counties because of that. But the model's not set up on utility service territories. It's set up on counties, unlike, say, an energy system model. So we'll do our best to map between the two, but it's not going to be a perfect fit.
Got it. Let's see, and then a couple of questions from Martin Gibbons. Why don't I read both of those, and Scott, I think could go through them in turn.
Okay.
The first is, how are the results of the impact analysis fed back into the energy model, and whether there is a feedback effect around assumption checking, product market replacements, et cetera. And then the second question is whether we can extract education and training requirements forecast through the model.
Sure. So the feedback issue is kind of a technical discussion and one we are going to explore when we actually do like a first loop of integrating these. Normally, the only thing that an economic impact model might provide to an energy system model is what demand there is, what load needs to be served in the electricity sector, how many VMT need to be driven, whether it's whatever type of vehicle we're using, or how much transportation needs to happen if we're including mass transit, needs to change in the transportation sector or the heating sector, for instance. We'll have to see if the macroeconomic changes and the population changes that are induced by the energy system scenarios cause big enough of a change in the economic impact so they change the state economy enough where you think that doing an iterative loop is really kind of worth it. It may be, it may not. It's usually my experience that the economic changes tend to be smaller than the energy system changes, but we'll see when we get to that point. So it's a good point to bring up. We'll have more updates on that for you later. The other point is education and training. So I'm going to scroll down to this slide here where one of the points here under REMI and IMPLAN is employment. And employment isn't just as an industry concept in the model. So think of everybody, or think of your family and your friends. You can kind of classify your job in two ways, and this is the way the federal data does it. You have an industry. Mine's professional services. I work for a consulting firm. A lot of you work for industry, or you work for the state or localities, so you'd work for the government sector or the related utility sectors and the like. But another way to classify your employment is your occupation. What do you do day to day is really where the training thing comes from, like what occupations are needed throughout the economy. So for instance, somebody with an engineering degree could work for lots of different firms. They could work for utilities, they could work for manufacturers, they could even work for service firms. Professional service firms and banks hire engineers as well. Somebody with a trade degree could work for a construction firm, a manufacturing firm. They could work on maintaining real estate infrastructure, all sorts of things. So the model just doesn't look at the results and the impacts by industry. It also looks at it by occupation. So what types of jobs are created and what are the impacts in different types of jobs and what are the needs there. So I didn't have employment distinguished in the slide as being by industry and occupation, kind of those two dimensions. But that's how the results are going to be set up. And with the occupation results, we can make some nods and analysis towards the question that you had.
Great, thanks, Scott. Let me go to George Kahn. George, you've got your hand raised and it looks like you're unmuted. You want to just...
Right, thanks.
Yep.
So I might have missed this. So early on in your presentation, you were referring to greenhouse gas reductions. And I think what you said was that you didn't look at it except for the impacts of air pollution and other local issues. So much of Washington's energy policy, almost all of it, is based on the achievement of certain greenhouse gas reduction goals. Almost every policy that we've been looking at has been passed into law, been done by the executive branch, is driven by the achievement of certain greenhouse gas reduction goals, which are always looked at in terms of how are we going to get there, how much it's going to cost, and what are the trade-offs. So I'm wondering if you could explain how those kind of economic issues are considered in this model, or if they're not, how do we use the model to better identify what policies are economically advantageous for the state given its goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Sure. So this is an important and kind of technical point, but I'm happy to discuss it. So this is about how the models map into each other. And the energy system model, as we mentioned, is going to have results for greenhouse gases. That's one of the main points of this, of course. The point here is that the economic model itself doesn't have really a direct impact from saving greenhouse gas emissions because it's a global externality. It's a global issue. There's not something specifically beneficial to Washington State by saving those emissions to only Washington State. So as a consequence, you can't say that if Washington reduces its emissions, that this would lead to certain mitigation of certain climate effects, because we don't know what the rest of the world is necessarily going to be doing. So it's still part of the analysis. It's still coming out of the energy system analysis, and it's still an important part about this. but making the leap that if Washington saves emissions, it's going to have XYZ climate mitigation effects is not something that this modeling typically does.
Can I quickly just ask a follow-up?
Sure.
So I appreciate that answer, but I think I would challenge that many of the policies that Washington State has put into place and many of the reasons for those policies that have been stated during various hearings and sessions and actually in the implementation of these programs has to do with the impacts of the contributions of the state of Washington's greenhouse gas reduction targets to climate reduction. So I'm a little concerned about, is this analysis going to give us good data if the impacts of the policies of the state energy strategy, which have been formulated to make an impact on global climate change, is not going to be included in the economic impact analysis? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a modeler, but I just wanted to tee that up based on the history of our programs and policies in the state. Thank you.
Sure.
Great.
No,
Go ahead, Scott.
I don't know if there's a question. Yeah, I don't know if there's really a question there. But I'll just say that it comes down to what I said a second ago, is that because it's a large, complex global climate system, Washington's goals are worthy and important for their own sake, and they are kind of the motivating factor for why we're doing this here. But we can't necessarily link one-to-one that Washington reduces emissions and therefore the global climate system changes substantially to the point where some negative effects that we're anticipating in the future don't happen as a consequence. So I've never really seen anybody try and model it like that on the regional level. I always get asked this question whenever we're talking about any state or any region that does this kind of thing. And the answer is always the same, because the scale of the greenhouse gas emissions are so large globally. And what Washington is doing is focused on the local level, that you can't make a one-to-one tie there. That's significant that you include in the economic structure.
Okay, thank you for that answer.
All right, let's see. There are a couple other questions that have come in via chat. This one's from Derek Gruen with Front and Centered about saying the distributional breakdown in the model is good, but it's limited to the top level results, which don't fully capture public interests like cost of living, health, et cetera. Are there other top level results available, or is that the complete list? And then also, what about non-market activity? Is that captured anywhere, or any other limitations or caveats to know about?
Sure. Cost of living, yes, definitely included. It's not on the list, but it's one of the important things in the model. There is essentially a CPI, Consumer Price Index, so what it costs to live in a place or time. So that's included inside the system. Non-market activities, so uncompensated work, so volunteering, time spent caring for family and friends, all that kind of stuff, isn't really present in these models, and that's true of any model area analysis we're looking at, and that's because DEA, BLS, Census, and them don't track it. So that's a caveat that's fair to include, that when we mean macroeconomic, we mean the federal definition of it, which is pecuniary economic activity. Pecuniary means related to money, so it's compensated. But there are other things, like you mentioned, that are uncompensated or volunteer-based that aren't in this model or any other model and won't really be accounted for here. But again, cost of living definitely will.
Great, thanks, Scott. And we've got probably about another 5 minutes or so for questions, and we've got about 3 or 4 in the queue. So I think we're probably good. Let's see. So here's a question from Clay Norris. It says, you may have addressed this, but will the model accept input from pathways? Yes. The whole idea of this is that pathways, comes up with a couple scenarios. We map outputs from pathways, which are essentially the blue ones here, into variables in REMI and IMPLAN, which are the gray ones here. And then we see what the economic model says, what the implications of the energy system would mean for the broader economy and for certain sectors and for cost of living and for different populations, all the things I talked about a few slides after this one. So yes, that's the idea. Great. And then from Senator Carlisle, is there data from California and Oregon about biofuel markets compared to Washington and a role of low carbon fuel standard relative to economic impact?
I think that one's more of a question maybe for the energy system modelers on the call. There's been a lot of studies done, I know, about low carbon fuel standards and advanced biofuels on the West Coast. And REMI as a model has licensed models to several different groups to do those. I don't have a direct answer for you there. That might be something better to bring up with the Pathways folks about how they're treating that and how they're treating the rest of the West Coast region. But the economic model here, like I said, biofuels will be integrated into the structure. It's just not in there, but it'll be integrated into the structure. But I don't have a real specific answer for you there.
Great. Yeah, and maybe we can hold on that one. We'll be talking about the pathways analysis here in a little bit, and maybe some insights there. Let's see. And seeing a clarification on an earlier comment. A question from Rebecca Ponzio, whether you can describe further how the results will include who's benefiting from investments and how sensitive are those results, for example, job transition, et cetera, where the jobs are located and what demographics of people working.
These questions are essentially the questions that'll be asked, and in most cases, probably all cases, never know till you do it, but these are the ones we are going to endeavor, and I think we have the methodologies to answer. So this is the kind of distributional equity analysis. These are the ways that we're going to analyze that question.
Great. And then Dan Wilson asked the question about the availability of the presentation. All the presentations from today will be posted to the website right after today's meeting. That's one clarification question from Derek Gruen about just to clarify, cost of living as a result generated from the model.
Yes, REMI is going to take in the variables that the Pathways comes up with for energy prices for all different energy commodities. And then it's also internally doing calculations about how housing prices will change, how wages will change, how cost of production will change, all that kind of stuff. And it'll net those all out with each other and come up with a change to what the model calls PCE, which is personal consumption expenditures, but it's really just a CPA concept, or CPI concept, excuse me. So it's the index for what the cost of living is, and we'll have an idea of what that's going to look like as a consequence of the scenarios.
Great, thanks. Let's see, we got a couple more minutes for questions. We've got one in the queue from Clay and another one from Sandy. So why don't we do those, and then if there are additional questions that people have for Scott about the economic analysis, we can always follow up after today's meeting. So from Clay Norris, is it fair to assume that a scenario with a focus on locally produced fuels, biofuels and electric fuels, would result in higher equity scores?
No idea how to answer that one right now. It may be the case, it may be not, but trying to ask me and the project team for very specific answers about what the impacts and distributional things are going to be right now before we've done all this, hold the horses. We will get there. Those will be interesting conversations, but we're not ready for that yet.
Yeah, great. Yeah, keep in mind that question is out there. Great. And then finally, a question from Sandy Edgemon. Scott, you explained the differences between the models. Will you repeat how we'll benefit from using two models?
Sure. The main advantage that IMPLAN is going to have in this is that IMPLAN is more detailed on the sectoral level. So REMI has about 70 industry sectors, just good detail. But IMPLAN has about 500. That's the first thing, is it gives you more sectoral detail. And the other thing is REMI is, I'll just say it, it's not cheap. Licensing it is not an insignificant percentage of the project budget. Licensing REMI for a lot of geographic detail is well into the six figures. It would chew up, way too much of this budget can support. So what we're going to do is we're going to use IMPLAN's detail on the sectoral level, and the fact that IMPLAN, I already have a license, it's very cheap, a license to a county level IMPLAN model, and county below some cases. So we're going to do a little bit of hybridization where we use the IMPLAN detail at the geographical and the sectoral level to do some mapping and allocation of the REMI results in the dynamic sense and the long-term sense at the state level, so we can have more informed results at a local level. So the main benefit of IMPLAN in this is just being able to address more of the equity and distributional analysis in the sectoral and the geographic sense that we couldn't really do with REMI unless we had far more budget than we do to buy a like $200,000 county level model.
Got it. All right, great, Scott. Thanks so much. I know there are a couple more questions that have come in, but I also just want to make sure that we're keeping on time. So we'll be able to respond to any of those additional questions in the follow-up from the meeting today. And Scott, thanks so much for the presentation and for the Q&A and folks' thoughtful questions about the economic analysis. I want to turn at this point over to Jeremy Hargraves with Evolved Energy Research for an update on the deep decarbonization scenarios analysis work. For this meeting, we distributed and this posted to the website a summary of the proposed scenarios. And I know that most of the people on the call today have been part of one or more of the webinars that Jeremy held in May. So Jeremy, why don't I turn it over to you and or to Eileen if you want to introduce Jeremy. And then Scott, if you could stop sharing your screen.
Sure. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, you can just go right ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, so I can share my slides once Scott has taken his slides down. He may have just left for a moment. So in the interim, there was a couple of questions that came up in that last section that I think that I could add a little bit more color to. So the first one is from Senator Carlisle on, is there data from California, Oregon about biofuel markets compared to Washington and the role of a low carbon fuel standard? So in our model, we are representing the potential for biofuels in many different states, really every state in the US, and the opportunity for importing fuels derived from those biofuels into Washington state. And the import pathways are represented by transport costs that are either pipelines or other mechanisms of importing those fuels. So that's kind of the technical representation of how we can procure fuels from other places. The low carbon fuel standard, we're not representing that in the model because the concept here is that we are identifying what is the lowest cost thing to do just from a nuts and bolts, cost of steel in the ground, cost of the fuel themselves. And the low carbon fuel standard is a potential policy mechanism that would enable us to use different fuels or change the distribution of the fuels that we use. And so it is a policy that would be considered in policy development, going into the technical advisory process that we're about to talk about in the next section. But in the model that we're building is the target that we want to hit with those policies rather than model the policies themselves. So that's what I would say to that question. And then the other one that George raised on GHGs, I want to add a little bit more color to that. It's not that we are not considering the impact of those GHG policies. In essence, everything that is coming out of the Rio model and the energy systems modeling work that inputs into the economic impact analysis that Scott is doing, that is all implicitly because of the GHG policies that we're implementing. So all of those investments, the changes in the way that we use fuels are all a result of those policies that we're then evaluating in the economic impacts model. So even if we're not considering the economic impacts of changes in climate on Washington, we are considering all of the economic impacts of the policies themselves and implementing those policies. So it looks like I can share my screen now. Let me pull up the slides. So can everybody see my slides up on the screen now?
Let's see, Jeremy, it looks like we're seeing
No.
kind of a very small piece of your slides, or
I'm seeing an odd, yeah, they're expanded in some
Oh.
odd way.
How about
there,
now?
Yeah.
that's much better. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And see if I can turn my camera on here as well. Okay. So in this section, what I want to do is just talk through the decarbonization scenarios as we've developed them through this last month. And it's really a review of the material that was covered in the last webinar. So a lot of people will be familiar with this. It's a good discussion to have before going into this next section on the technical advisory process, because the scenarios themselves and the results of the deep decarbonization modeling is framing up what these pathways look like going to achieving our goals in 2050 and the goals prior to that. And so they're providing that context that allows us to look at near-term actions, near-term policy in the context of what we're trying to achieve. How hard should we push in different sectors? What does that transformation look like to get to these really low emissions goals in the future? So I want to first start off with just thinking about structure here on how we're structuring the scenarios. And just before diving into this slide, which is talking about our decarbonization cases, it's worthwhile to think about what is the state doing if we weren't implementing any of these greenhouse gas goals over time. And we're developing a reference case to be able to look at that question, where if the state were to continue business as usual without implementing net zero by 2050 and the interim targets to get there, what types of investments would we be making in new equipment? Equipment wears out, we have to replace it. What types of fuel procurement would we see over that time, and how, with demographic changes and so on, would our loads change and influence the type of pathway we follow in that case? So that gives us that reference to compare to when we're thinking about decarbonizing the economy. How different in cost is it? What type of different investments are we making to get to a decarbonized future? And then this slide here is showing how we're structuring those decarbonization cases. So it's structured around a central case. This is the core of the decarbonization cases, where we have a common set of assumptions that are, most of those assumptions are pooled into every other case we're looking at as well. And so that gives us this nice comparison point, and it sets us up to be able to look at these what if questions, where we change something about that central case to investigate what that something would do to investments prices. An example of that would be between central case and case 3 in this diagram, what if lower electrification in buildings and industry? By just changing things about electrification in buildings and industry, then we're able to make conclusions about attributing differences in investments and attributing differences in cost to that particular policy. The central case assumptions are relatively unconstrained on technology availability in state and out of state, aggressive electrification and efficiency, no measures taken to reduce service demands, which is a conservative assumption. We're really asking here that question, can we decarbonize even without behavior changes? But one of our scenarios, you see case 5 in the diagram, we're looking at what if we did get reductions in service demands, reductions in VMT, reductions in other areas of the economy. And then just leading into that, those satellite cases, we are asking these what if questions to be able to test different types of policy in the Washington state economy that have come out of the discussions with the advisory committee the last 6 weeks with the state, with other experts, and we're still working on the assumptions of each one of these cases, consulting with experts in the state to be able to include the best data and the best assumptions about how the system might evolve over time. A little bit more detail now on each one of the cases. So starting with reference and central. In the reference case, we are assuming no emissions constraints beyond what we already have, or no emissions constraints in Washington, but we are holding existing policies such as CETA, the things that are on the books right now, those will be implemented going out to 2050. And then the central case, we walked through a few of these assumptions already. With the WEC states, what we're assuming for non-Northwest is that existing clean energy policies are applied. In the Northwest, Idaho, Oregon, Montana, then we're assuming 80% below 1990 levels, target from the Northwest Deep Decarbonization Study. Service demands remain business as usual. All resource options are permitted for electricity and fuels production, and that includes building nuclear in the state. Fuels trading between states is allowed, including pipeline construction. For biomass, we are using the DOE billion-ton study for biomass potentials in various different states. We're consulting with experts in the state on Washington biomass studies and alternatives for pricing biomass. Transmission expansion between states is permitted, so we could expand or identify and build new corridors to bring in additional energy from renewables. And then load management through dispatch of new flexible load technologies as the stocks of our various energy consuming technologies in residential sector, commercial, industrial, as they evolve with new technologies coming into the economy. If they have flexible capabilities, then those will be dispatched for optimal least cost planning in our model. There's two low electrification cases. So the first is low electrification and efficiency in buildings and industry. And this is giving us that opportunity when thinking about how far do we push, what sorts of measures do we implement in the buildings and industrial sectors. What are the benefits of pushing hard on electrification and efficiency? So in this case, we're looking at slower action. Basically, the assumption here is we take our central case with all those same assumptions in it, and then we transition in efficiency and electrification at a slower rate. So we get to a lower level by 2050 and look at what the impacts in alternative investments for decarbonization and total cost look like. And then low electrification in transportation, it's really the same concept, but applied in the transportation sector. What if we retain a higher proportion of gasoline and diesel burning vehicles by the time we get out to 2050? What do we have to do in other areas to be able to lower emissions in the state, and what kind of cost impact would that have? And then the final two cases here, the first is behavioral changes. As I discussed a couple of slides ago, we're looking at the case where customers do change the way that they use energy. One example is reduced vehicle miles traveled, and that could reflect shifts in usage of different forms of transportation. And then also reductions in service demands in other end uses that reflect customer behavior changes. And then finally, constrained renewables and transmission. This is a case that there's been a lot of interest in, where it's one of the great uncertainties of transitioning to a lower zero carbon economy. We have to build up so much new infrastructure that it uses a lot of land. There are difficulties already in siting renewables, in siting new transmission. siting new transmission corridors. All of these things take a long time in planning and permitting. And if we can't get as much as we think we can get in the central case, what is the impact of that? So in this case, we're taking that central case and we're reducing the resource potential. So we can build less wind, less solar, and we're putting tighter caps on installation rates. So we can build less renewables per year, as well as limiting the opportunities for expanding interties between Washington and the surrounding states. So what kind of impact does that have on costs? What are the alternatives to be able to meet our emissions targets, while at the same time dealing with these more significant hurdles than what we assume in the central case? So the takeaway from all of these scenarios and how this plugs into the rest of the analysis is it's really representing challenges and hurdles that may have to be overcome by the various different types of technical advisory committee policy development processes. What are the benefits to being able to get more electrification, of being able to incent behavior changes, of being able to get faster siting or expanding transmission? And if those benefits are significant, how hard should we push in each one of those policy development categories to be able to accomplish more? So it's framing up just how much of a transformation is needed in the economy and giving additional data points to facilitate good policy development in the next step of the process. It's also developing all of those inputs that feed into the energy impact modeling that Scott just described in the previous section. So that's all from me on scenarios. We had a deeper discussion of this a couple of weeks ago with some more information, which is up on the website at the moment. I don't know if we're taking any questions just now or whether we're taking our break. I'll pass it back to Tom.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I see that there are several questions coming in on the scenarios analysis. Here's my thought, because I do want to make sure that we're moving along and giving folks a break. After we come back from the break, we're going to be talking about the technical advisory process and doing some breakouts around a set of framing questions, et cetera, et cetera. I think some of the questions that have come up in the context of Jeremy's overview are probably relevant for those discussions in the breakout. So what I would encourage folks to do is sort of hang on to those questions. If it feels relevant to bring them up in the breakout discussions, I would encourage you to do that. If it feels like those questions are still lingering or not addressed in the breakouts, let's capture those and be able to do follow up with people on that. The pathways analysis is going to be ongoing and to some extent evolving over the next bit here. So there's opportunity for back and forth on those. So with that, let me just let folks take a little bit of a break here. Maybe we would just take 5 minutes or so and see if we can reconvene at 10:35, and we will talk then about the technical advisory process and go into those breakout discussions that I just alluded to. So for those who are following on YouTube and on TVW, this group is going to take a break for about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll reconvene right around 10:35. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started again. I'll look for some people rejoining video to make sure we are indeed reconvening. All right. Great. Thanks everybody for a shorter break than anticipated. I'm in reviewing the chat. I just want to publicly recognize that there's a lot of energy around the decarbonization pathways and the scenarios analysis discussion. So why don't we just at this point say we recognize that there are several questions and thoughts that people have on that. So why don't we think about that in terms of follow-up, and I think to some extent on the technical advisory process discussion might get to some of that, but clearly there are more questions about the scenarios analysis and some thoughts that folks want to share on that. So message received, and stay tuned for how for the follow-up on that. Eileen, it looks like you might want to jump in. Yep.
Yeah, I spoke to Jeremy during the break, and he's writing up answers, and so we'll make sure that we get answers to all these questions out to the advisory committee. I don't know if we'll have enough time in the breakouts; they're so short, and we do want to get the input on the questions, but we will definitely have written answers that we can get out to the advisory committee soon after
Great. Thanks, Eileen. Appreciate it. All right. So on the technical advisory process, why don't I turn it over to Mark Dodon with with SETI and with Michael, and to Michael Lazarus as well with Stockholm Environment Institute. So Mark, I'll let you take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully the right screen for the presentation I have. So everyone see the wood chipper there? All right, let's move things around. So what I'm going to do is explain a little bit more about how the technical advisory process works and set us up for the breakout sessions, and Michael will also contribute to that. So as we spoke about the technical advisory process last time, we've evolved the approach to that. Some since we met, we've reached out to you to see how you want to be involved in what sectors. Many of you have responded to that. We put you in touch with the sector lead. So as we begin the effort, we'll be engaging you more, which I'll talk about in a minute. So what I'm going to do is just sort of recapitulate the purpose and focus of the technical advisory process, talk a little bit more about our approach to both identifying and assessing policies and actions and how you can contribute to that, and how you're engaged in that, how we expect to engage you, what the output of this will look like as we currently envision it. And then I'll turn it over to Michael to talk about the framing, set us up for the framing questions and the breakout sessions. I think the discussion we've had about the economic analysis fits into this, the discussion about the scenarios, which really underpin the work we're going to be doing on identifying policies and actions which move us forward to our goals. So to refresh, this slide comes from the last advisory committee we had. What are we doing here in the state energy strategy, and how does the TAP process fit into that? You know, our goal is to achieve the legislatively mandated GHG reduction targets and have the energy sector contribute its piece to that. And those targets have been set pretty clearly for electricity and overall for net zero, while you know, maintaining a competitive economy, including competitive energy prices, addressing equity issues, meeting the needs of low-income, vulnerable populations in both urban and rural areas, addressing workforce development, those considerations. So we have multiple objectives we're trying to achieve here. And I think Reeves's statement at the beginning about the importance of people is front and center, even though we're calling this a technical process. It's really about how do we have an energy system that works for people. So we're going to be coming up with a roadmap of sectoral and cross-cutting actions that move us forward to achieve those goals. And those encompass, we're calling it policies and actions, but really a broad range of legislative, programmatic agency action, private sector action, how we might advocate federal action, addressing, again, a range of issues. So we're not just thinking about what is going to be the legislative package next session, but more broadly, policies and actions over the next decade that move us towards the goals we have set for ourselves. And again, we want to emphasize that in the TAP process and throughout this whole effort, we're looking for that creative, positive focus on how do we find solutions that get us moving forward, where we can work together to get solutions to meet the decarbonization goals and the competitive and equity goals that we have. So the process itself is focused on the policies and actions piece of this that support, that will be the basis for the state strategy. So the scenarios sort of tell us what needs to happen. And as we look across the central case and the scenarios, we'll be able to sort of dial in on a range of things that we need to have happen between now and 2030 and then beyond. And then the policies and actions are what we're going to do to get there. So that's really the basis for the state energy strategy elements. We're going to be, the process engages subject matter experts, including advisory committee members or specialists from your organization in this process. And it also is likely to include practitioners from, say, the clean energy sector who are involved in, implementation. So we're looking for those experts to help us provide input on what options to consider, and then help characterize and assess those policies and actions in terms of their effectiveness, their efficiency, the feasibility, how they address equity and achieve our goals there, what their impact is on different communities, what are some of the trade-offs or potentially unintended consequences of those. So we bring a certain amount of expertise as our team to this, but we're looking to engage you and other experts that you may be reference for us, but also we look to folks in the state government and outside state government and people really across the country who've worked with some of these policies and actions before to help us think through what could be effective in this state strategy. As we all know, we're focusing on 4 sectors, and we're going to do breakouts by sectors and look at questions across all the different sectors. But throughout, there's cross-cutting questions and issues and cross-sector issues that both, from a sector perspective and then through other efforts that we'll put together examining how to, address those cross-cutting and cross-sector issues and the solutions there. We've started with defining the framing questions and key issues, and that's really the focus of today. From there, we identify and are really, just in the beginning stages of saying what policies and actions address those, act as solution sets for those, and then how do we group those together maybe into packages or suites of policies and options that together will help us meet the criteria that we'll look at in a second and really amplify on the slide before about what our objectives are here. All of that will provide the basis for developing draft strategy recommendations to bring to the advisory committee, but ultimately our job is to set forward a set of recommendations to Commerce. So the output of this process will be policies and actions that, again, the big 3, put us on a path to meeting clean electricity and emission reduction targets by 2030 that there's a milestone for 2030, and then we're on our way towards 2050, that improve and sustain our economic competitiveness and all the dimensions of that, and that facilitate the equitable transition, including workforce development and historically disadvantaged and disproportionately affected in rural communities. Criteria that relate to that and are particularly topical now is how does this plan and the strategy support recovery from COVID-caused economic downturn, and that's where Scott's work will help us with that. Obviously, we need reliability and security of our energy system, maintaining affordability, as I mentioned earlier, avoiding the lock-in of investments and infrastructure that that basically locks us into that higher emissions pathway. So we have to find the right balance there to get us on the path and stay on the path with the investments we make. Position us to leverage federal stimulus if that becomes something that is made available out of the federal government as we work to recover from the COVID at the national level. And then we'll look with a lens for feasibility, both in terms of the short term and the long term. Some things may not be feasible today, but could become feasible if we lay the groundwork for those. So this is the policies and actions, and then those packages will be screened in the context of these criteria, and together meet these for the sectors and for the entire state energy sector. So this slide really just puts it all together in terms of identifying the check-in points and where the advisory committee is engaged formally, some of the gates along the way here towards a report, and then I'll talk a little bit more about how this technical advisory process is going to work. We've talked today about the DDP modeling scenario and sensitivity work, and how that comes in the work that Scott's going to do on microeconomic modeling. So today we're at advisory committee meeting 3, and we're going to be discussing and getting your feedback on the framing questions. Are we looking at the right issues in the right way for each one of the sectors? So we'll get your feedback on that in today's meeting and through follow-up. We're working on the background documents which frame up the issues, including the questions, but also include a summary of what legislation and policies are already in place and what are some of the activities that are referenced elsewhere in other states that may be of use to us. So those are in process, and we hope to have them completed by the end of the month and distributed to the advisory committee members as well as the public, and sort of inform each one of these sector TAP processes. The central case that Jeremy spoke of earlier will be the first case out of the modeling that will be presented, I think, in a webinar format in early July. That will give us at least some insights into sector-specific sort of levels and results and insights that inform some of the sort of types of policies and actions and the level of ambition that we need to be considering. That will also be amplified later during July and maybe early August by the results of the sensitivities and the scenarios, which will be presented as they become available. We hope in the July meeting to bring back to you from this work. Really, it's going to happen relatively fast, a draft set of policies and actions by sector and goals, which would really be sort of what levels are we shooting for, say, in terms of the amount of efficiency in the building sector or the amount of electrification in the transportation sector, that type of sector goals. Share that with you, get your feedback, and then bring back draft recommendations in the late August meeting, and that ultimately leads to the report and our recommendations to Commerce and a public process. The technical advisory process itself is going to really consist of a series of discussions, really topic-specific discussions, where we engage with, we pick a particular issue and we reach out to advisory committee members who have expressed an interest. We bring in experts that we've identified, or you suggest experts and practitioners that could help with that discussion. And that could be in a Zoom format, could be in a small webinar format, could be even in a smaller group format, to really engage again on specific topics that come up that we need to dig in on, that will really emerge from the framing questions that we're talking about today. So you'll be kind of engaged in that to the extent that you want, and we've already had, as Eileen mentioned at the beginning, people bringing forward ideas and suggestions for scenarios and discussions. So we'll continue that sort of organic involvement process. So that's what we're going to be doing starting after this meeting and throughout the next couple of months, to really dig in on the research and assessment of the policies and actions that will get us to our goals. As I said, the DDP modeling will start with the central case. The scenarios will be presented as they become available after that, and the sensitivities I think some of the questions that were raised in the chat could get to those sensitivities will be brought forward to really serve the needs of the TAP process and our decision making here. And then the macroeconomic modeling follows that in terms of, with our final sort of package of draft strategies, what are those economic impacts, and what's the impact on equity, and does that get us where we want to go from that standpoint? So that is a quick overview of our process, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael to talk about the framing. As we have questions coming up in chat, we'll try to deal with those in the breakout sessions where we'll be in smaller groups and we can really have more of a conversation about the questions people are raising. So please feel free to post those and we'll do our best to answer them then. And we'll also do, as Tom suggested, write up summaries of questions that we weren't able to answer that we want to make sure everybody understands the approach on. So, Michael.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. Yeah, stay at that opening slide for a sec. So I'm just going to give you a quick walkthrough of the framing questions, just to tee us up for the breakout sessions, because the key element here is hearing from you all. We really need your guidance and feedback right now. Are we identifying the right high-level issues that are going to frame the technical advisory process? So they're still draft. So the title really should say draft framing questions. We're looking for your feedback. Next slide. So you should all have received, I think, from the Ross team, a 6-page PDF of these framing questions. And I suggest that you all have that on hand now for the upcoming session if you don't already have it. So the way they're organized is that they all have an overarching question. For example, for the electricity sector, with efficiency and electrification as top priorities to achieve decarbonization, what policies, investments, and other actions are needed in the coming decade to meet CETA mandates and put the state on track to meet climate goals. They're organized around a series of key topics. The question, are these the right topics? Are these the right questions to be asking within generation resources, for instance? The question of the balance between centralized and decentralized resources. The questions of transmission and siting. How can we set up the transmission and siting needed to bring the level of resources we need for the levels of electrification that we need to get to, as indicated by some of the scenario work. And you see equity may be listed as 7, but it's integral to the whole work. As Mark emphasized and Reeves noted at the beginning, we're not going to succeed at this work unless we embed equity front and center to all the work that we're doing here. So next slide. I'm going to be really quick here because the important thing is these breakout groups. Just to note that each of these sets of questions, and let me just flag that Mark is the technical process lead for electricity. You're all familiar with Mark. Let me introduce colleague Derek Brokoff. Derek, you there? You unmute, just say hi.
I'm here.
You are.
Hello.
Right. Derek is the lead for the transportation sector. And there the question's a little bit different because unlike for electricity where we already have CETA and 100% clean goal and milestones along the way, we do not have similar goals that we're reaching for, as Mark mentioned, for electrification, for clean fuels, for reduction in vehicle miles traveled. So the question there is, how do we, what are appropriate levels informed by the modeling analysis and other inputs that you all bring? And what are the most effective and efficient and equitable policies and actions to achieve them? Next slide. So again, for the building sector, a slightly different set of questions, but we're all covering some of the same issues. You'll see, for instance, local governments, the key role that local governments play, and that's also integral to transportation solutions. And if you look at the actual detailed questions, everyone gets to that in those lists of questions. So let me just do a quick shout out here to Poppy Storm, who we're pleased to have from the 2050 Institute to join us to lead the building sector. Poppy, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Poppy. Introduce yourself. Okay, great. Then finally, the industry sector, which brings a whole set of different questions. Because of the nature of industry, unique suite of industries we have here in Washington State, including a number of emissions intensive, trade exposed industries with a number of unique processes that, that create challenges and opportunities for decarbonization. So there, let me just a shout out to Roel Hammerschlag. Roel, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Hello, everybody.
Okay, introducing Roel again to y'all. Roel is going to lead the industry sector. So let me just turn at the end here to the questions we're going to be asking in these breakout questions, in these breakout sessions, which is, let us know, are these questions that you see in this handout, are they identifying the key, broad, high-level issues that should be addressed within each of these TAP sectoral groups? And remember, we're also going to be addressing cross-sectoral as well. And what modifications, specific modifications and additions would you suggest? What resources should we be consulting? What experts should we be bringing to the room? And if time permits, we'll also, during the sessions, get to any particularly promising policies and actions that you think need to be considered as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tom, and in we go to breakouts.
Great, thanks, Michael. Let's see if Michael or Mark, if you want to stop sharing your screen, there we go. And let me just let me quickly share mine for a little bit of the logistics here on the breakouts. So what we have done here, we'll be going into 3 different breakouts, and they're going to be topically oriented, but not topically limited. So what we want to do is sort of focus on the particular sector of the breakout. But if folks have issues, questions, things they want to make sure are on the table for other sectors, this is an opportunity to bring those in as well. But partly this is in the interest of time, and partly to make sure we've got the right topical experts in the right places. So we've done our best to try and identify people with areas of interest. If we've missed the mark, we beg forgiveness at this point, but also invite input on other topics through those. We're not going to be doing full report outs coming out of the breakouts, just in the interest of time. What we're going to be doing is capturing the information from the breakouts and reporting that out after the meeting, and then that goes into the individual technical processes by sector. To the extent that there are kind of process questions too that come up in the breakouts, we'll track those, and that can be part of the synthesis and report out to be able to answer questions that people have around process. The breakout sessions are going to be recorded, and along with the meeting recording, they will be posted, but the broadcasting is going to be paused just for technical reasons. So for those who are following on YouTube and TVW, there's going to be a pause here, and for everybody, when we get into the breakout sessions, if you can remind the facilitators to hit the record button on the breakouts, that would be helpful to get the collective memory going here. Also, for folks that are following along on TVW and YouTube, I just want to remind you that we'll be coming back together at about 11:45 for the public comment period. So if folks have comments that they want to bring in at that point, please submit those to energystrategy@commerce.wa.gov, and we'll read those or paraphrase those as appropriate when we all come back together at 11:45. All right, so at this point, I will turn it over to my colleague, Heather Martin, who will get us into the appropriate breakouts. We'll go to about 11:35 or so. We'll get a notice out when we've got 5 minutes remaining before we come back together.
Excuse me just
Yeah,
for a second,
Eileen, go ahead.
Eileen. I just wanted to note that there are a lot of questions in the chat that were about the scenarios. And so I want to make sure that advisory committee members know that we're going to figure out a process for making sure that we get all those answered, which might need to be making another webinar soon, or individually talking to each of the people who have raised their questions. So I just wanted to note that we're seeing them, and I know that we didn't have time to handle them, but we're tracking them, and we'll be getting back to everybody, and or bringing together people as they wish to talk deeper about that.
Great. Thanks, Eileen. All right. Let's see, Heather, so I will turn it over to you to get us all into the breakout sessions.
Okay, so, and just as we did in the March meeting, it might be a little jarring, but I'm going to start them now and you will go to your appropriate breakout room. So for the people, John and Alex and Katie, Jason, are you able to join your room?
so jarring.
Yeah, everyone take a deep breath. That always feels like traveling through hyperspace involuntarily from one universe to another within the Zoom multiverse. So
I have can
take a
we
moment.
adapt this? Can we adapt this technology for when we actually come back to in-person meetings?
Get to send each other into random rooms and
It would save a whole lot of time on the transition between one meeting and another.
and no long goodbyes. The counter just starts clicking and you've got to go. Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I was in the transportation discussion, and it was highly informative, very focused, and made a very good use of what is inevitably not enough time. I hope the discussions in the other breakouts were similar. There are some next steps I want to run through before we move into the public. The public comment period that'll start here in just a couple of minutes. But before I do that, I maybe just turn quickly to Mark and to Michael and just see if there's any key highlights, not topically from your sessions, but anything relevant to kind of next steps and follow up from this meeting that we should put on the table.
First, we need to make clear how all this great input and feedback, there's just a lot of resource that we need to direct to this. So just quickly tap that, keep the momentum.
Yeah, and
Mark, I think
we had a lot of topics to cover and ran out of time. So we want to set up and be very clear about the process for folks to send additional comments in. And some people had a lot more detail to add by email, so we can capture that and bring that in under each of the topic areas. But we got a lot of great input on electricity and began at an industry. And it's very helpful to have to hear from you as to where you feel like we need to dig in, and that certainly became clear, as well as more richness to the topic areas.
Great. Thanks, Mark and Michael. And I would echo that from the transportation session as well. So let me just run through some of the kind of next steps and follow-up items that I'm tracking here. So number one is that the presentations, the recording, and the summary from this meeting will be up on the Commerce website. We'll make sure that advisory committee members know when that goes up, has the links to those materials. Number two is there are clearly some areas where we need to be following up from the discussions and the questions from today. So one thing I'm tracking is on the framing questions, getting back out to folks about a way to provide additional comments and insights into those, especially where people were in discussions but had thoughts about other sectors. We'll put our heads together on the best way to do that in an efficient way and get that input from folks to follow on the breakouts that we just had. Number two is reflecting on the deep decarbonization questions that came up earlier. There are still questions there. We will put together a Q&A from the meeting today. As Mark alluded to in his presentation, there's also going to be a webinar in July on the deep decarbonization analysis, which is an additional opportunity to get engaged on that. But I would encourage people, not just on the deep decarbonization work, but on anything that we've gone through today, to follow up with questions. The teams are ready and available to answer and discuss. Let's see, a few more things. On the technical process, we have heard from several people about which of these kind of sector discussions you want to be engaged in. I would extend that invitation out to others who haven't gotten back to us now that there's a better sense of what the process is gonna look like. For those who've identified their interests, I think the next step beyond the kind of refining the questions piece is going to be to share the framing document around that particular sector. And then the topical leads who we've identified in the meeting today will be following up with interested folks about the specifics of that process. And then I think you've all gotten a message about rescheduling our July meeting to later in the month. We're targeting July 23rd in the afternoon. Now, the reason for rescheduling that was just to make sure that the technical advisory process had enough legs at the point that we all got back together again to be able to look at that that evolving body of work, and for people who've been engaged in, you know, a particular sector, being able to see what's happening in the other sectors. So thank you all for your flexibility in scheduling. And then I guess the last thing to say is Nancy and Reeves earlier in May had distributed a memo that included a revised charter that had the COVID-19 statement from our previous meeting in that. We haven't heard anything back on that, so it sounds like that is probably fine, and we'll be posting that, that charter up to the website to take the place of the draft charter. All right, I think we do need to move into the public comment process, and I would start that by thanking folks who've been following us on YouTube and TVW and have submitted comments. I'll turn it over to my colleague Andy Chin, who's been receiving messages. Andy, to you to either read what has come in, or to the extent that needs to be paraphrased, doing that.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Can you hear me? Good, okay, thanks. So we have about 4 public comment messages that have come in during the course of our discussion today. First is related to state energy strategy public participation and hearing the discussion and Q&A. This is from Brandon Housekeeper at Puget Sound Energy. Just wanted to let us know, it's disappointed in the process used by Commerce for the broader public viewing and participation, highlighted by today's meeting where public presentations were made by consultants, but the Q&A was deferred to the breakout sessions that the public was not allowed to access. While PSC has a representative on the committee, it's important for the broader group to be able to hear the discussions, even in the breakout group sessions, especially to answer questions relative to the presentations and materials. Technology is available to allow for better public participation in this effort. Commerce should better provide this opportunity in addition to the recordings. Next up, we have a comment from Tony Usabelli from the Department of Commerce. Tony wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to comment, and he wants to underscore the need to widely and fully engage and educate the public and non-energy organizations in the process and outcomes. He wanted to tie this into the increasingly critical consideration in our world of pandemic, economic recession, and demands for social justice and systemic reform. And he reiterated one of the guiding principles for the group set forth by the legislature to ensure that the state's energy system meets the health, welfare, and economic needs of its citizens, with particular emphasis on meeting the needs of low-income and vulnerable populations. So Tony thanked Reeves for his opening statements around that and urged the group to deeply examine the equity questions presented as part of the framing question discussion, and ensuring that any of this group's recommendations fully address those elements. And he wanted everyone to know that the success of the state energy strategy is a long-term guide for our state's energy future depends on how those questions are answered. And then Tony has submitted a paper by an individual from Arizona State University called The Ethics of Energy Transitions that he wanted to share with this group, so he'll send it around. And I just wanted to note that Tony is, I misspoke, Tony is formerly with the Department of Commerce. He's not currently with the Department of Commerce. He's retired, so he's considered a member of the public. So sorry for that correction. 2 more comments. One from Jessica Koski of Blue Green Alliance. I very much appreciate the technical team lifting up the economic analysis in light of our current financial crisis. It's important that we're grounding work on the state's energy strategy in economic impact and equitable development. Thank you for taking the time to help us understand the models. It's clear from today's presentation that we'll be able to glean a lot of high-level insights. It's also important to recognize the limits of these models. A lot of the information that we'll need to identify, evaluate, and address distributional and workforce impacts may be buried in net impacts. We need to be equally clear about what these models won't tell us so that we can seek to address those blind spots. The more granular the results, the better. Also want to note that workforce and procurement policy can play a major role in increasing the positive economic impact of investments, but this won't be visible without some type of scenario-based modeling. When it comes time to translate model outcomes into policy recommendations, it will be important to be proactive and intentional in making sure that we're creating those high road economic opportunities with equitable access and preventing manufacturing leakage. And then one other comment, last one, from Donna Albert, no affiliation provided for Donna. She says that agricultural biofuels, I'm sorry, and the title is Biofuels Caution. Agricultural biofuels have huge land use implications and emit about as much CO2 as gas or natural gas when burned. It's nearly impossible to assign enough CO2 sequestration from the growth of biomass to eliminate this quantity of emissions. For instance, it's generally accepted now that corn ethanol is not climate friendly. She'll provide written comments later on that, on the limitations of other biomass sources. I am concerned that any scenario that assumes a significant amount of biofuel use of any kind, not just corn ethanol, could create a market that locks in climate damaging practices on a large scale over a long period of time. In general, burning biomass on a large scale for electricity generation to heat buildings or to power vehicles will not compare favorably to lower emissions options. And she said she'll provide additional comments. So those are the public comments. Thanks for listening.
Great. And thank you to everybody that has that provided comments, and for those who have been following along on YouTube and TVW for the morning. We really appreciate both your interest in this topic as well as your input to it. We also will be there in the fall. There will be more extensive public outreach and public engagement process as well. Let's see, I want to just maybe turn to our co-chairs, put you on the spot here at the end of the meeting, and Reeves and Nancy, see if there are any closing thoughts that that you have based on this morning's discussion.
I'll just say very briefly, thank you everybody for keeping such a great people first attitude today. I think it's really heartening. With that, I'll hand it over to Nancy.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I also appreciate the significant level of input, and I recognize the frustration that everybody feels in not having enough time and not having as much of an opportunity to kind of fully interact with each other and the modelers and the technical team in a way that where they really feel heard and feel like the inputs they're providing are being done more than just put on a list. So that's a frustrating reality of our kind of current situation and our ability to have just a limited set of meetings with all of your time. But I do have confidence in the technical team and the state team that they are listening and they are hearing the inputs and trying to balance all of the goals that the legislature set out when they put the state energy strategy guidance together. So again, I thank you for that, and keep all the input coming. I know I have a long email teed up to Eileen and the technical folks on questions that I have, so don't be shy.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, and I would just emphasize that. I mean, we all are adapting to the world that we're in, and we're balancing the means that we have to engage with folks here. So, do let us know about things that we can do to help engage folks. Dan, I'm seeing you've got your physical hand raised.
Thank you, Tom. I just want to make a comment, and that is from a process perspective, if at all possible, I need more time to process the materials before the meeting. So I got this, I got the materials 2 days ago, and I've got other things scheduled to take care of. And I know that you guys are, I want to acknowledge that you're doing a lot of heavy lifting here, but I could use more time to not only analyze the materials myself, but also to get feedback from my constituents. So on those materials. So anything you can do to give us more time before we actually get into these discussions would be greatly appreciated. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And I'm sure you're not alone. Thank you. All righty. Well, good. Well, thank you everybody for your time this morning. Clearly lots of work to do, lots of follow up from today's meeting, but so good to see you by video, and at some point we'll get to see each other in person again. So long.
Might as well. Yeah. And it should go